Okay, good. Well, good to see so many of you, and thank you for going through your lofts and garages and so on. So we've got quite a number of things to go through, and with this severe timekeeper, we need to move on. So I'm covering really the early days of the practice, but in a second I'm going to call on Bill Cairns. You've already seen quite a lot of this, and you'll recognise Brian in 78 and 2004. Hasn't changed a bit, has he, really? And back in 1975, when we have one of our early brochures, this is the offices in England, and that's, as I say, one of the early brochures. But I think at this point, I'm going to ask Bill to talk about early days as students together.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to see so many people here. Congratulations. You've all made very long journeys. Anyway, I'm going to give a very impromptu memorandum of Brian's and my long-term relationship. Because we first met at the Royal Botanic Garden, he having sailed in the Med and me having been posted in Cyprus for 9 months during our national service. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Good. So,
it's being recorded though.
So, oh yes, right. Okay. When we arrived at the Royal Botanic Garden, none of us knew anyone, apart from one person, Robin Curry, who was another big, tall fellow who shared many of the ambitions that Brian and I had. But we were really on a different plane from many of our fellow students who were imbued with deep sense of commitment to plants and growing and horticulture. Whereas we were looking beyond the detail of horticulture because we felt that we had already mastered the fundamental principles of that subject. So we looked way beyond just the narrow confines. And at the RBGE, of course, we were a bit of a phenomenon. We were known as the 3 Cs. And each of us competed against each other. So it was a highly competitive and very interesting environment. But Brian, because he has fundamental qualities of leadership, really took the lead as far as the 3 Cs were concerned. And so with our established contacts in Edinburgh through Jane Wood, who was a very early landscape architect of the old school, and Alan Riach, who's already been mentioned by Annabel, we were inspired to look at landscape architecture because we said, well, what are we going to do with this horticultural situation? My father was very much against me going into landscape architecture because he had a very wrong vision of what it was all about. So he thought that horticulture is a scientific base, continue with it. But I deviated. Oh yes, I've got a yellow card now. Anyway, what I want to talk about is leadership. And what is it? If Brian had stayed in the Navy, I'm quite sure he would have become an admiral. If he had been in the army, he would have become a general.
I aspired to becoming an able seaman in the Royal Navy. I never had my focus on becoming an admiral.
Well, it depends on where you channel your ambitions. But anyway, these qualities of leadership, I think the first one that comes to me is compassion. Because a good leader has to be compassionate towards his colleagues. He always had a level playing field. He was always very ready to share his ideas and ambitions with his classmates, and particularly Robin Curry and myself. He was a regular visit to my family because I had 3 sisters, and a brother. And so on. But I'm not going into anything else on that department. I've not been flashed a red card yet. But anyway, we had a wonderful relationship because it was self-generative, and it was also inspiring because we inspired each other. So what's that effing chap up to next? And because we were pretty military trained at that time in our language. But that didn't hide naked ambition. So we went to Durham, and one of the best professionals we ever met in our life was Brian Hackett. And he inspired us into the whole business of ecology. So I'm now into the red zone, so I'm going to try and wind up. So compassion is one of the qualities of leadership. But the other thing is drive. So if Brian saw a target, he had to reach that target. He had to actually command that target and take possession. Now the other thing was affability, because he was excellent with his clients, and he inspired his clients. So therefore he was the epitome of what a first-class professional should be. So therefore to Brian, I owe a huge debt of gratitude, and I'd like you all to join me in these sentiments. Thank you.
Bill, thank you very much. There are advantages and disadvantages of not having rehearsed this. And one of the disadvantages is that we're going to run out of time quite quickly. So I'm going to take you back to this 1975, but I wanted to include this, which I think is most remarkable. I found a cutting from 1972, the Evening Chronicle, I presume the Newcastle Evening Chronicle, launch of Ecoplan with Dr. David Bellamy, if you remember him. And so I think a very significant step in the development of the profession. By 1988, Brian had moved into the Australia and the Far East as well, and the number of offices you can see in the UK. Now, in between times, offices had come and gone, but that was the state in 1988, the time of what we used to call the Big C in terms of the brochure. And there you can see Peter Dowen, and he's here, talking about Clouston is now the biggest in Europe. And Brian was saying earlier that at one point about 25% of practising landscape architects had or did work for the practice, which again is also remarkable, I think. And in 1990, he was awarded made the Officer of the Order of the British Empire. By 1992, RPS had taken over both Bill's practice, and Brian became chairman of RPS. So there were offices of RPS, Cairns and Clouston throughout the UK. And then in 1992, after a profit rise, which is a nice point on which to end, Brian stepped down from chairing RPS. So that's a just quick overview of the development of the practice. And then in 2020, another important landmark, Brian was awarded the first recipient of the Landscape Institute's Legacy Award, which again was important.